In this video, we're going to get an early jump on the 2023 fantasy basketball season. I'm Alan Seslowsky. He's the expert, Nick Whalen. Nick, I'm already starting to look at some mock drafts for fantasy basketball, and the top 12 players, top 10 players for fantasy already seem there's no consensus just yet. Let's go through your top 10, and we'll see how it changes throughout the offseason. Okay, if you're on the clock at the first pick overall in 2023, who are you going to take?
Well, unless you're in a league that does not value points, rebounds, assists, field goal percentage, free throws, it's Nikola Jokić. It's one of the all-time easiest calls. As long as I've been playing fantasy basketball, I don't know that there's been a more obvious number one player. He's been the number one overall guy in virtually every format by a wide margin, not only this season, but last season. He was even better in 21-22 than he was in 2020-21. Again, an absolute no-brainer at the top. If you have the number one pick and you don't take Nikola Jokić, I'm eager to see why you would make that argument.
I think the draft is going to start at pick 2. We're going to have a consensus on pick 1. So who is it that you're going to take if you have the second pick?
It's tough. There are a ton of candidates this year, but in our 150, we settled on Steph Curry. You know, he did fall to 7th overall in per game value by the end of the 21-22 season, but he got off to a scorching hot start. Just kind of hit a prolonged slump by Steph Curry standards. Had by far the worst shooting season of his career, but we're expecting a bounce back from Steph. The Warriors should be really good again next season. He should age well as he gets into his mid-30s. The value that Curry gives you in the three-pointers made category especially is so huge. As long as he stays even relatively healthy, that's a massive advantage. So for me, Steph Curry is still the number 2 player behind Nikola Jokić.
I can remember when it was an exciting pick to take Steph Curry. Now it's the boring, correct number 2 pick. Who are you going to take at the 3rd overall pick in 2023?
Again, 2 through probably 7 or 8, you could put these guys in just about any order, depending on preference. But we settled on Jayson Tatum as our number 3 player, a big-time riser in the second half of the 21-22 season. Got off to a terrible start as a shooter, but I think, Alan, over the last 40 or so games of the season, he was a top 3 player in the NBA. He's super durable, and he's still young enough that we could project another leap. You know, a lot of these guys in the top 10, we kind of know what to expect. They're either in the middle of their prime or maybe on the tail end of it. Jayson Tatum, you know, we don't know exactly what his ceiling is going to be. So with a lot of these guys, you know what you're getting. With Tatum, if you're taking him 3, 4, 5, you know, you're hoping that maybe he can make even another leap on top of the one that he took this past season.
Yeah, it seems like Jayson Tatum has become one of the most 5 important players in the NBA already. That's interesting. All right, who are you going to take at pick 4? We understand that this is more of a tier, but with RotoWire, Nick Whalen's on the clock. Who are you taking at pick 4?
You know, we settled on Giannis Antetokounmpo as our number 4 overall player. And that's acknowledging the fact that he does not have a number 1 overall player ceiling. If you're taking Giannis at 4, you're not hoping he finishes number 1. The problem is the free throw percentage. It's better than it was a couple of years ago, but in terms of fantasy basketball, if you're playing 8-cap roto, Giannis's free throw percentage is low enough and he takes enough that it's going to prevent him from climbing probably past number 7 or 8 in the ranking. So it may seem counterintuitive to take a player like that at number 4, but he provides so much value in terms of counting stats. He's so durable at his size. You know, you have to kind of go in knowing that you're going to either punt free throw percentage or you're going to have to draft some players later on to help balance it out. But the other areas that Giannis produces in, he's so strong everywhere else that he's still worth a top 5 pick in my mind.
I always say you can't win your fantasy basketball draft in the first round, but you certainly can lose it. And Giannis prevents that from happening. I like that call. Okay, who's going to be your 5th pick when you're on the clock next year?
Yeah, this one might seem a little counterintuitive, but it's James Harden. He's still a top 5 guy. And you have to look at this past season, which felt like, by all accounts, a complete disaster, right? I mean, kind of still up and down as we move through the playoffs with the Sixers. The Nets situation was a complete debacle, and yet you look at the rankings and James Harden still finished 5th in per game value in fantasy. He's still a counting stats machine. He's still a free throw and free throw percentage machine. That's a huge advantage. Even when things are going wrong, even when it feels like he's not playing nearly up to his potential, he's still one of the best fantasy players in the NBA.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, and he'll be a polarizing player too. Do you think that James Harden is going to play as close to a full season as we can expect from a first-round player?
You know, I think so. He was such an Iron Man, really, through his prime years with the Houston Rockets. That was never a concern. And, you know, he's had some kind of knick-knack lower body injuries these last couple of years, but it does feel like more of his games missed have been due to just not being happy with the situation. So if we're to assume that, you know, he re-signs with Philly and things are good heading into next season. I think just having a stable environment for James Harden, really for the first time in a few years, is going to go a long way.
Okay, I'm interested to hear who you have at pick 6 then for next year.
I have a guy who finished number 2 in total value this past season, and that's Trae Young of the Atlanta Hawks. Super durable player for his size and build. Also a younger player, should continue to get better as he ages. Giving you 28 and 10 on 46% shooting, 3 3-pointers per game this past season. Somewhat of a one-man show for the Atlanta Hawks, which in terms of team success, maybe not the greatest thing, but for fantasy, that's ideal. So Trae Young is a player. If you could get him at 6, that's great. I think he's going to go a lot higher in a lot of 2022-23 fantasy drafts.
Right, you're picking in the middle of the round. This seems like a good value spot, but the options are running a little thin as far as first-round players. There's still a couple guys I bet you like here.
There are a ton. I mean, there's so much talent at the top of the league right now that, especially with guys like Damian Lillard and Kawhi Leonard returning, who missed a ton of time or didn't play at all last season, there are guys that you're getting not only with the 7th pick, like we're talking about here, but there's guys you're going to get in the teams that would ultimately be first-round picks in a lot of seasons. So at number 7, Karl Anthony Towns, I think a big-time value at this draft slot. He had a great bounce-back season in 21-22 after missing significant time in each of the last 2 years. He was super durable to begin his career. It looks like he's back on that path. The Timberwolves flamed out in 6 games against Memphis, a little bit of a disappointing end to the season, but statistically, Towns remains a unicorn, all-time great shooter for a big man, gives you the defensive stats, gives you the points, gives you the rebounds. He's the player that at number 7, he legitimately has the ability to finish maybe as high as number 2 overall if everything breaks right.
Yeah, the more that you talk about these guys in this range, it sounds like I want a late-round pick. All right, who are you going to take at 8?
At 8, we have Kevin Durrant. And Durant is one of the hardest players to value at this point in his career for fantasy. He finished number 2 in per game value this past season. So he was the second best fantasy player on any given night behind Nikola Jokić. But the injuries are a massive concern for Kevin Durant at this point. He turned 34 in September. He's played only 90 games over the last 3 seasons combined. Of course, he missed his entire first season with the Brooklyn Nets. And luckily, he hasn't re-injured the Achilles. He hasn't had any major injuries, but it feels like, the hamstring acts up, the knee acts up, the ankle acts up. I don't think that's going to change as he moves into his mid-30s and kind of his post-prime years. So he's still going to be an elite player on a per-game basis, but he's in that zone now where you almost have to handle him like a Joel Embiid, like a Kawhi Leonard, and like even LeBron James, who at his advanced age, you kind of have to pencil him in for at least 10 to 15 missed games. And the last couple seasons, it's been a lot more than that.
Yeah, these guys are starting to get up there in age a little bit. Still in their still in their peak, but certainly on the other side of it. It's interesting. All right, who's going to be the 9th player if you're sitting in that slot next year?
At number 9, we have Luka Doncic in our rankings, and it feels like we're still waiting on the true fantasy breakout for Luka Doncic. I think his real life value exceeds his fantasy value at this point, and honestly, he's a lot like Giannis in some ways. I mean, the free throw percentage has quietly become a pretty big issue for Luka Doncic when you're talking fantasy. He takes a ton. He's always going to be up near the top of the league in free throw attempts. And he's at 73 and 74% at the line over the last 2 seasons, respectively. So, if you're taking 8, 9, 10 attempts per game, that's really going to hamper your fantasy value in 8-cat leagues. Well, Alan, in our top 150 for next season, we have Joel Embiid coming in at number 10. And maybe that feels a little bit low considering he's coming off of the best fantasy season of his career. But you have to keep in mind that Joel Embiid playing 68 games feels like the absolute best case scenario. So while he's somebody who could finish top 5 in terms of per game value, you can't necessarily depend on him to play even that many games next season. So we're expecting maybe a little bit of regression in terms of games played, even as Embiid is at his statistical peak. So that knocks him down a bit in our rankings.
Is he a candidate to get overdrafted next year?
I think he is. I think people who saw the production that he put up, again, on a per game basis this season are going to view Embiid potentially as a top 5 guy. And you're just asking a lot from a health perspective.
Of all these players in your top 10, I mean, they're first-round players. They're all good players. But who would you be most scared to click the button on? Who has the most bust potential of these great players?
For me, it's Joel Embiid. It just has to be because of the injuries. And we have to respect, how great he's become on a per-game basis. He's a complete monster. He's a guy you want on your roster. But to me, he's almost on my do-not-draft list. Of course, there's a point at which I'd take virtually any player. But I always want to opt for the safer option, even if that player has a little bit of a lower floor. Embiid on a per game basis could be as high as number 2. He's one of those guys, but Again, I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic with players, especially big men, who have the injury history that Joel Embiid does. So if he's on the board late first round, I would think about it, but he's not a guy I would take any higher than number 10.
Is there a player that's probably can go in this late second round, mid second round, that could end up in the top 5 overall? Who's our sleeper?
I got a couple for you, Alan, and they're both young guards. One of them in the Western Conference, one in the East. DeJounte Murray, we have him at 14th in our rankings, and Tyrese Halliburton is the other. We have him at 19th. Both of these guys finished as first-round values this past season in terms of total value. They were number 1 and number 2, respectively, in the NBA in total steals. Both of them great all-around producers. I mean, Murray in particular nearly averaged a triple-double this season with 2.0 steals per game. That is insane. If he can improve his free throw percentage, even just a few points, he was at about 79% this season. If he can get that up to the low to mid 80s, he has top 5 potential for sure. He's just one of those guys that I think you're going to be able to get at a slight discount because unlike a lot of the other names in our top 15, top 20, he really only has 1 season of elite production, whereas a lot of these other guys have been doing it for 5 or 10 years.
If you want more videos like this, just click the subscribe button on the RotoWire YouTube page, and to see all of RotoWire's fantasy basketball content, premium articles, videos, advice, rankings, cheat sheets, dynasty, everything, go to rotowire.com/try.